Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the Jigme Kelsang Show. Today is a milestone day for my show as we have a special and exclusive interview with one of the best sports radio personalities and one of the best insiders in the National Hockey League. A huge warm welcome to NHL insider Darren Dreger. Welcome, Darren, to the show.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
So, how are you doing?
I'm doing okay. Like a lot of people around the world, obviously dealing with vast uncertainty in every aspect of our lives, and no different professionally in my life as we kind of sift through things that are going on around the National Hockey League and that aren't going on around the National Hockey League, and just trying to do whatever we can do to make sure that hockey fans are, continually informed by everything that is changing continually, almost on an hour-by-hour basis.
Mm-hmm. And, what a roller coaster week it has been, not only for the sports world, but for the National Hockey League especially. Just given that the NHL has been on suspension now, you're seeing all these sports cancellations, and there's basically nothing to watch on TV. And it's like, the only thing you're watching is like CP24 and just seeing what's going on with this whole COVID-19 situation. So we'll get into that a little bit later on, but, first off, let's discuss the Toronto Maple Leafs. There has been a lot of worry this season about whether or not they will make it past the first round of the playoffs. And so, given your reputation as an NHL insider, what are your honest thoughts on the Toronto Maple Leafs season so far?
Well, I think it, frankly, has been a predictable year for the Toronto Maple Leafs. I was one who believed at the start of the year that this was a team that was going to go through some difficulties and go through some struggles and face some adversities, primarily because of how young the Toronto Maple Leafs are. And, when you look at the blue line, obviously it went through a significant overhaul. Maybe things haven't worked out as perfectly as Kyle Dubas was hoping, but that's not to say that, it isn't a good developing team. And I'm always careful in making projections or predictions. Predictions make guys like me look foolish at the end of it all. But I number one, they're a playoff team, so that's not going to be an issue. But I think it's going to be a stretch for the Maple Leafs to get through the first round. But in saying that, and I'll also acknowledge what every Leafs fan who's listening to us is going to say, oh no. There's going to be considerable disappointment from the top of the organization through if they don't get through the first round of the playoffs. But I wouldn't look at it as a long-term crisis from a hockey perspective. I think that, this is a young team, no different than the Washington Capitals or the Tampa Bay Lightning, the Boston Bruins. Go through the list of teams who, have found a way to win, go deep in the playoffs. Sometimes you have to learn how to lose first before you can appreciate what it takes to win. Everything that has to go in that, the commitment, the sacrifice, all of those things. And these young players for the Toronto Maple Leafs have gone through a lot of that this season. So I'm not suggesting that they can't win a playoff round. Of course they can. I just think that it's going to be very difficult, especially when you look at, assuming the playoffs do happen this year, who they might match up against, be it the Tampa Bay Lightning or potentially the Boston Bruins. Mm-hmm.
And, there has been a lot of, you got to think as like NHL insiders or just NHL analysts in specific. You look at the speculation that all Maple Leafs fans have been wondering about, like, will General Manager Kyle Dubas make a big splash in the offseason if things don't go according to plan? And so, like, in terms of your NHL insider perspective, like, what are you hearing in terms of the Toronto Maple Leafs so far?
Well, as far as a bigger deal, they're going to have to. I just don't see any other way. And, a big deal can be one of two ways. It can be a big trade. It can be an unrestricted free agent signing. Turbulent times. I give Kyle Dubas some credit. He did not swing for the fence at the trade deadline. Didn't feel like it was the appropriate time to do that. But you do look at that blue line, and you see that Cody Ceci is a free agent. Tyson Barrie is a free agent. They did extend Jake Muzzin, which I thought was excellent work by Kyle Dubas and the Toronto Maple Leafs. But they need some internal development to happen as well. And there's no reason to think that it can't with Rasmus Sandin or Timothy Liljegren or any of the other young pieces that they've got developing on that back end and up front as well. But I'd be a little surprised if Kyle Dubas didn't try and acquire a defenseman, particularly somebody on that right side. So let's hope that he's in a position to do that. Let's hope that we're all congregated again and talking about these types of things in a realistic format, other than, looking in the bigger picture and speculating on what they need or what they might do. There's so much uncertainty around the world right now that it's almost impossible to expect anything beyond speculation to actually happen at this stage.
Mm-hmm. And, just like listening to a lot of Leafs radio and sports radio, or just hockey radio in general, I mean, the big talk of it all has been over this past week, it's been all about the COVID-19 situation. And so, what are your thoughts on this whole suspension, and what are we hearing in terms of the NHL? What are the next steps that we have to look forward to now?
Well, I mean, it's a moving target, right? The CDC, which is a governing health body, has recommended that, there are no gatherings with 50 or more people for the next 2 months, the next 8 weeks. So obviously that heavily influences and impacts pro sports, and in this case, the National Hockey League. So I would say best case scenario, provided that, the world feels like they've got COVID-19 under control, which feels, as we have this conversation, as a bit of a stretch, to be honest. But let's just pie in the sky, go into dreamland for a moment, and there is some sort of miraculous cover here that manages to contain the virus. The National Hockey League has identified that in a perfect world, they'd establish a mini training camp, if you will. 45 days. Into the 60 days, which was recommended by the CDC. So that would be best case scenario, absolute best case scenario from an NHL perspective. And I feel like that's probably a lofty goal at this time.
Mm-hmm. And so, on Saturday, the National Hockey League held a GM's conference call based off of what they can or can't do during the pause. And so what's the latest just surrounding that?
Well, it's changing, and you're right. They issued that memo, and then just a few days later, that memo was amended, and it was done so in bargaining with the Players Association. So initially, the National Hockey League wanted the players to stay in their club city, in their NHL cities. They couldn't go to their arenas. They needed to self-isolate, all of those things. Well, as of today, NHL players can return home, wherever home might be. And, for some, let's use Morgan Riley of the Toronto Maple Leafs as an example. He comes from Vancouver. So whether or not he's elected to go back to Vancouver, I don't know, but he's got the flexibility to do that. And likewise, for all of the other players. For the European players like Freddie Anderson, obviously it gets more complicated.
Yeah.
We all watched Prime Minister Trudeau's address of Canada earlier today, and effectively Canada has closed its borders to European travel. So it's become a real problem for professional athletes, not just NHL players, and frankly, that was today. So who knows what's going to come tomorrow, or what might happen the day after, or next week, or next month. I mean, again, those are the uncertainties that everybody in the world is having to deal with, not just specific to the NHL.
Yeah, and so there has been a lot of speculation that you might have noticed, over this past week and maybe even the coming months, as to the question surrounding, will the NHL resume its season, right? And I think a lot of people have been saying it's not going to resume because of the way that everything has been playing out recently, right?
Yeah.
So just given those kinds of perspectives of fans, what would you tell those people based off of what the NHL has done so far?
Well, I would say let's not worry about it. Number one, it feels like there are bigger concerns. Not to preach the obvious, but I think everybody needs to pay attention to their own little world, and even though sport and the National Hockey League has historically been a great distraction, it really doesn't matter what's going to happen in the foreseeable future with the National Hockey League. What I know is that there's nothing definitive. There are people out there speculating that it would be a long shot at best, or even more worst case scenario, speculating that the NHL won't return this season. Mm-hmm. We don't know that. Nobody knows that.
Yeah.
The World Health Organization doesn't know that. The CDC doesn't know that. So, rather than speculate on what may or may not happen, I feel like it's healthier and it's more respectful to just stay in the moment. And I think everybody needs to maintain whatever level of optimism that they can. I mean, starting with, again, containment and getting the COVID-19 virus under control. And that's a big ask, but if that were to happen, then the conversation that we're having today about the future of the National Hockey League would very swiftly be answered, for sure.
Mm-hmm. And I mean, if you go back to the trade deadline, right? I mean, a lot of speculation was on what was GM Kyle Dubas going to do during that whole session, or whatever you would like to call it. I mean, there was a lot of people wondering, are they going to make a big splash in there? But eventually they didn't. I mean, they could have made a big splash, but why was the reason Kyle Dubas didn't make any trades?
Well, number one, you've got to have a trade partner. You've got to have the right fit. And I'm going to assume that any, meaningful trade conversation that Kyle Dubas had with the general manager, willing to part with either a top four defenseman or an impactful forward, would have wanted pieces from the Toronto Maple Leafs that Kyle Dubas just didn't want to part with. You're talking about the obvious. You're talking about William Nylander. You're talking about Rasmus Sandin. You're talking about, pieces that Toronto would never consider trading, at least not at this stage. And then on top of that, you've got the salary cap. The Toronto Maple Leafs in season spend a lot of time negotiating and navigating through the ebb and flow of the salary cap and how they're impacted by it. So for the Maple Leafs to make a trade, they couldn't take on additional salary. It literally would have had to have been dollar in, dollar out.
Yeah.
And then again, if you're talking about a player that's going to be of value, then you're giving up a high player of value in return. So it was a difficult time. The trade deadline doesn't always offer up big trades.
Yeah. But, I mean, to you, just on the trade deadline again, to you, who was the number one winner of the whole day? I mean, the trade deadline has been a big talk, but who was the winner in your mind?
Yeah, I mean, that's a good question. Around the trade deadline, I thought that the Ottawa Senators did very well in parsing out, the pieces that Pierre Dorion moved. He got a great haul for JT Pajot from the New York Islanders. So I think that there was a group of winners. I like the work that Don Waddell and Tom Dundon did with the Carolina Hurricanes. They got better. I mean, the fact that they landed Vinny Trocheck from the Florida Panthers is significant. I mean, he effectively is the number 2 center in the National Hockey League. And to be able to obtain a piece like that in season is very, very difficult to do. And, he acquired a quality defenseman from the New York Rangers. So, I mean, I thought that the Carolina Hurricanes did a nice job. And likewise, the Edmonton Oilers and Kenny Holland. Kenny Holland added some support pieces. Now, it was unfortunate Mike Green got hurt as quickly as he did. Athanasiou, I think, is an excellent complement player. He might need a little bit of time to kind of get used to his surroundings in Edmonton. And Tyler Ennis was terrific with the Ottawa Senators, and I think he'll be a real good Oiler as well. So those 3 teams, for me, really stepped it up.
Mm-hmm. So just wrapping up on this whole situation regarding the Leafs or the NHL in general, what can we look forward to from the Toronto Maple Leafs moving forward? When the season resumes, or even in the off season, what can we expect from them?
I mean, it's a good question. I do expect that Kyle Dubas is going to continue to try and put his stamp on the Toronto Maple Leafs. What does that mean? It's going to be difficult to say. I mean, we need to understand the business when the game is back in play. What's that salary cap for next year going to look like? And how is that going to influence any decisions that Kyle Dubas has to make? as we talked about earlier on the show, clearly, he's going to have to do something with his blue line. If Tyson Barrie goes to market, and I believe he will, Cody Ceci goes to market, I believe he will. Those are two veteran defensemen who log a lot of minutes.
Yeah.
So I think it might be unrealistic to expect Rasmus Sandin to fully take on a role like that. And I'm convinced it would be unrealistic for Timothy Liljegren to accept that type of a role. So I think that there's going to be, obviously, some work that needs to get done on the blue line for the Maple Leafs.
Mm-hmm. Just some final thoughts on the NHL season suspension. Just in terms of just what you're thinking about this whole pandemic and everything. I mean, the panic buying of everyone. It's been crazy to see those types of things. And, I personally think that I'm going insane. And, I think a lot of people, question a lot of that. It's why are people overreacting a lot of this? And why is the media, blowing out of proportion a little bit? And, just if you can give us some final thoughts on, this whole pandemic.
Well, number one, neither of us is an expert in this field. And so in saying that, I do trust the experts. And when I hear the World Health Organization issue the warnings and the hourly updates, and then likewise for the CDC or Health Canada, I take it very, very seriously. The job of the media is to dispense information.
Yeah.
How we consume that information is entirely up to us.
Yeah.
But, we're not closing borders in Canada as Prime Minister Trudeau did earlier today.
Yeah.
Unless the pandemic is a very serious global issue. And of course it is. So anyone who doesn't believe it needs a reality check in a big way.
Yeah.
It's in a perfect world, we'd be talking about sports and we'd be continuing to speculate on what the Toronto Maple Leafs may or may not do. That's ultimately what sport is. It's a distraction. It's entertainment for all of us who need all of that to break away from the seriousness of world situations. But this is one that we can't hide from. This is one that doesn't have a distraction. There is nothing outside of staying in your home and watching Netflix or doing whatever it is that you do inside your own rooms that can be viewed as entertainment or a distraction. But the threat is real, and I'm not questioning any of that.
Mm-hmm. And so, just one last thing. What advice would you give to young people who want to get into radio or just anything in general?
Just do your homework. Know your stuff. Obviously, talking on the radio isn't just about endlessly talking. You have to be informed.
Yeah.
One thing that I always adhered to as a young up-and-comer in the business years and years and years ago was do more listening than talking. Everybody has an opinion. There'll be a time when your opinion matters. And that's not to say that you shouldn't speak your mind, but if you want to be a journalist, you have to ask informed, educated, intelligent questions, but you also have to be willing and able to listen, absorb the message, and then follow up when necessary. So that would probably be the first thing that I'd put down on a piece of paper is listen more than you talk.
Well, thank you very much, Darren Dreger. That was NHL insider Darren Dreger on the Jigme Kelsang Show. Thank you so much, Darren, for taking the time out. We really do appreciate it.
My pleasure. Thank you.